This month we're talking about prayer and meditation as a very important aspect of our faith, the way in which we communicate to God, how we speak to God, but also, more importantly, how we listen. And I know as a society, we're not very good listeners because we hear so many things. And so trying to listen to a small, still voice in our minds is not our strong suit. So that's something a lot of times we have to work on. But it's a very important aspect of our faith because it kind of keeps us centered and gives us something to focus on throughout the course of the week. And as we move into this season of Lent and talking about this, I kind of want to jump ahead a little bit and talk about a story that took place at the death of Jesus and all the events that surrounded that event of his death, because that is a very important part of who we are. This is the time when God became very intimate to us, became very personal, very relational. And so it's important to kind of look at the stories that surround that. And so we're going to look at a story that's found in the 15th chapter of Mark 33 through 39. And to kind of set this up a little bit, before this particular reading, Jesus had been arrested, but he also had been beaten pretty good. Almost half dead, and they're trying to take him to the place where he was going to be crucified, but he was too weak to carry his cross, so they pulled a man out of the crowd. His name is Simon, and he had to carry the cross for Jesus to the place of where he would be crucified. So they put him on the cross. They stood him up between two thieves, and there is the last scene of his life. And the last thing he hears are the soldiers mocking him, ripping his clothes and dividing among themselves, kind of souvenirs of sorts, calling him the King of Jews, and then the crowd just kind of ridiculing him. And so all this is taking place. And for 3 hours he had been on that cross when we read these words. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. It's perfect weather for the story. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he's calling for Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with some sour wine and put it on a stick, gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let's see if Elijah will come and take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." As long as I can remember, I've never really understood the people of the Hebrew people and why they did some of the things that they did. You remember a guy named Moses? Remember him? Kind of important in biblical history. He spent a little bit of time in the mountain, right? Came down with something special. What was that? 10 Commandments, right. Y'all remember this, right? Y'all watch Charleston Heston. You know what I'm talking about? All right. Okay, so he came down with that. And those are some pretty important documents, right? Very incredibly important. The story doesn't stop there with the 10 Commandments. They were so important that they were instructed to build this big case. And they placed the 10 Commandments in the case. You know what they called that case? A box? You know what they called it? The Ark of the Covenant. All right. And so the Ark of the Covenant became a storage place where they carried the 10 Commandments. And that's a real blurry picture of that, and I apologize for that, but that's kind of was part of the instruction. Of course, you had 4 people or 2 on either side carrying this thing around, and it went everywhere that the people went. It went to wherever they ended up being. Even to wars, they would sit there. And that was just kind of a way that was the presence of God before the very people. And I can understand why they make such a big deal out of the Ten Commandments and the Ark of the Covenant. You know, after all, that's the first documents, right, that really came from God. Those are the biggies. And if you go to Washington today, you'll see a nice case of what? Y'all know what that is? What we have in Washington, D.C.? The Constitution, or what? Declaration of Independence, man. You see those there. You can't get close to that. That is a sacred writing, a sacred time in our history. And the Ten Commandments, I'm thinking, probably a little bit more important than that, right? And so you can imagine how much they had to take care of that, and how sacred those words were that came straight from God. But also understand that every time they carried it around, it reminded them of who they were, right? It reminded them of their history. It reminded a time when they were absolutely nobody, and then through the grace and the presence of God and the acts of God, they became God's people. Wow, that's a big step, right? It doesn't get much bigger than that. From absolutely nobody to the top of the line. That's pretty good. And so I can understand how important it was for them to remember their history every time they passed through or looked at that particular Ark of the Covenant. I don't have a problem with that. What I don't understand is how over a period of time, we humans are kind of predictable, how over a period of time that box or this Ark of the Covenant slowly became God. Instead of important documents given by God for our sake so that we could understand how to be God's people. We're kind of predictable with that kind of stuff, aren't we? That box became an idol. The image of God, which was actually in violation of the second, I think it was the second commandment, that they stored in the ark itself and carted around everywhere they went. And when they built like a tabernacle or the temporary structures of the temple, they would take that ark and they would place it in the middle of that temple to show the importance of that ark to the people, which is understandable. The problem was they start to build up the role of the high priest to protect this ark and to be the keeper of that, of the temple as well. And so this box became so holy that it was a holy priest or the high priest that was the only one that could communicate with this ark, with this box, with God, and then relay that voice to the people of Israel, just the common folks like y'all and me. And so when the ark was even stolen, the tradition of the high priest continued. Even though the ark was no longer there, the center part of the temple continued to be where God lived and resided. And they built a big curtain around it. And not only that, they made sure that the higher you went was only for the high priest, and the lower people were the next important people. And then the other less important people couldn't get this close to it, and so on and so forth. If you weren't even important, you couldn't even get in the city. So important was this, it became God, and that's where God was, and they protected that. I want us to think about that because you can imagine the way these people thought. And so when all of a sudden this guy walks around, and rumors are starting to spread that this guy was the Son of God, you can imagine how nervous it made these people, especially these strong religious types of folks. Here we kept God hidden behind a curtain in the temple where no one was allowed to even see. And this God has a son who's interacting with common people. I think that would be kind of a rebellious son, wouldn't you? Because this guy came around, what did he do? He healed. He forgave people. Only the high priest could do that. He ate with sinners, the very people that this God despised. This Son of God was even as common as the common folks. This God became real, became personal, became intimate, became available to all people. Not just the high priest, not just to the scribes who wore their fancy robes and the Pharisees, not just to the Jews, not just to the men, but to all people. And this Son of God proclaimed that God cannot be contained in a box or in a temple. This God went everywhere. Doesn't just stay in Jerusalem, but this God can actually go into a water well in the hated regions of Samaria. And this Son of our God conversed with an outcast, a 5-time woman who had been divorced. And even the guys she was living with and shacking up with, they weren't even married. But this guy came and interacted with this woman. The God in this box would never allow such a thing to take place. Our God despised such people, and to claim that Jesus is to be the Son of this God could not be a worse thing to say about God, period. That was just flat out blasphemy. And the only thing that's left to do is to take this person who claimed to be the Son of God and to hoist him on a cross for the whole world to see what a fool he was. It's kind of where our story begins. Because as we know the story, they couldn't keep Jesus on the cross. And when he breathed his last breath, the story tells us that the curtain that hid God from the world would tear in half from top to bottom. And through his very death, suddenly his presence, his spirit, his grace, his direction for living, his compassion was and is available to all people who long to have that personal connection with God. I don't think we take advantage of that enough in our personal lives. Because one thing that's important for us to understand, we talk about prayer and we talk about meditation, we're talking about communing with this very God. Making God very live in our lives so that our words and our actions become God-like in some ways. Where we can touch and reach into a world that is in need of touch. And finding our time to commune with this God every single day of our lives, even just for a brief moment, is so essential to building up our faith and to building up our character and to keeping us strong and to growing in our relationship with God and with one another. We don't utilize this enough in our personal life. This month, we're going to do more than just talking about the importance of prayer and meditation. Just like his daddy. We're going to do more than just talk about prayer and meditation. We're going to try to do some things in the course of worship that you can take home and just try at your time at home. So we'll also experience that. And so, Shannon, I'm going to let you do that.
Every month we focus on a different element. Last month was Scripture. This month, as Danny said, is prayer and meditation. Just real basic. Prayer means talking to God. Meditation is listening for God. And so, as we move into a new month, we don't leave behind what we've learned already, what we talked about with last month in Scripture. We add it to our tools for living a faithful life. And so, today we're going to connect Scripture with prayer and meditation and do an intentional Scripture reading. I hope everybody got one of these cards when you came in. This is for you to take home. It's 3 easy steps for how you can do this at home by yourself or with your family or in a small group. I'm going to read a scripture to you from the Gospel of Luke while Jesus is on the cross. The first time I read it, just listen. Listen at a basic level. What's happening in this story? So get comfortable. You might want to close your eyes. Maybe you want to look at one spot on the stained glass. Whatever feels right to you. Be comfortable. Listen to these words. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He replied, truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. I'm going to read this passage again. Pay attention to any words or phrases that stand out to you. Think about or meditate upon those words. Listen for what God is saying to you through this passage. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." I'm going to read the scripture once more. Talk to God during the reading of this scripture. Pray to God about anything you feel led to say, how you feel about this scripture, what you heard God saying to you. Hear these words. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise."